G'day all you cool cats and kittens, my name's Will and this is not only the most distinctive cross-country bike on the market, it's also one of the fastest and most efficient mountain bikes I have ever tested. This is the 2021 Trek Super Caliber. Now the Super Caliber is Trek's flagship cross-country race bike, and that sees it going up along the likes of the Specialized Epic, the Giant Anthem, the Scott Spark and the Cannondale Scalpel. Now I will mention that the full review of this bike is currently live over at flowmountainbike.com. Make sure you click the link in the video description below and that will take you through to the full review of this bike here. In this video here, I'll be giving an overview of the Super Caliber and why it has such an unusual suspension design. I'll be talking about what it does well on the trail, what it struggles with, and how it compares to some of the competition. Being a premium cross-country race bike, the Super Caliber is made from Trek's OCLV carbon fiber. It features a 100mm travel fork, and that's paired to just 60mm of travel out back. And this is where the Super Caliber differs from some of its competitors, which typically have 100mm travel front and rear. It's not exactly a Softail per se, but it does sit somewhere between a hardtail and a traditional full suspension race bike. And that's potentially an important gap to fill because racers are often choosing between the lower weight, stompable efficiency and precise handling of a hardtail versus the comfort, traction and control of a full suspension bike. With the Super Caliber, Trek has created what it believes is the perfect option that sits somewhere between the two. Now I'll admit that I was skeptical at first because although the Super Caliber is very light, it doesn't actually have the lightest frame on the market, and that begs the question, if it's not the lightest option, why would you compromise by having less rear travel? That's a very good question. It's one I can now finally answer after having spent the past 3 months testing this bike. To deliver its unique ride quality, Trek has employed a suspension design that it calls IsoStrut. The frame itself is made of two halves. There's a front triangle, and that's mated to a one-piece carbon fiber swing arm with pencil-thin seat stays, and these are designed to flex and bow as the suspension goes through its travel. The top of the seat stays come together and form a carbon fiber carriage which slides up and down an alloy stanchion that's bolted to the underside of the top tube. The carriage then drives a Fox-made DPS shock which has adjustable air pressure, air volume and rebound damping. It also has a remote lockout at the handlebar, and that will activate both the fork and the rear shock at the same time. It also gives the Super Caliber a really clean frame shape which looks more like a hardtail, and there's clearance for 2 water bottles, which is becoming an increasingly important feature on a modern XC bike. The frame is finished with some really nice clean but practical internal cable routing, and there's also the knock block steering limiter which is designed to stop the fork crown and the handlebar controls from smashing into the frame in the event of a crash. Another detail worth pointing out is where most brands typically offer 4 frame sizes, Trek actually offers 6 frame sizes in the Super Caliber. The geometry itself is quite sharp and purposeful. We have a 69-degree head angle, a 74-degree seat tube angle, and on the medium/large size, a healthy reach of 440mm. One number that does stick out on the Super Caliber is the low bottom bracket. The BB sits 53mm below the hub axle line on this bike, which is the lowest of any full suspension XC bike I've tested. The back end is also quite short. We have a 430mm rear center length, and it's worth mentioning here that the swing arm is actually different across the size range, and that's because the flex characteristics are different between the smaller and the larger frame sizes. Unfortunately, Trek hasn't used this opportunity to give the Super Caliber scaled rear center sizing with longer chainstays on the bigger sizes and shorter chainstays on the smaller sizes. That's not really a common thing in the cross-country world, but it does feel like a missed opportunity on the Super Caliber. For 2021, there are 5 spec options in the Super Caliber range, and all of those models use exactly the same OCLV carbon frame. The prices start at 8,699 Australian dollars for the Super Caliber 9.8 GX. The bike that we've been testing here is right at the other end of the scale. This is the top of the range model, the Super Caliber 9.9 XX1 Access model. Price on this, 15,599 Australian dollars. Now it is actually a little bit more than that, and that's because it has a very special holographic diamond flake paint job, which costs an extra $750 as part of the Project One custom bike builder. Otherwise the spec is identical, so we have a RockShox SID SL Ultimate fork on the front, a SRAM XX1 Axis group set, Level Ultimate disc brakes, Bontrager Covey XXX wheels, and carbon fiber everything. And that's very much reflected on the scales. Confirmed weight for our medium-sized test bike is just 9.5 kilograms, and that's with the tires set up tubeless and weighed without pedals. Now, I will mention here that at 175 centimeters tall, Trek actually recommends I should be on the medium/large size. But due to global bike shortages, only a medium was available at the time. The proportions are otherwise identical between the two sizes, except for a 15mm difference in the reach measurement. To round out the review, I did manage to spend some time on the bigger medium/large size, and I can confirm that's the size that I would personally go for. It is worth mentioning that the front end of the Super Caliber is quite low. There's a 90mm head tube on all frame sizes from small to large. And that means if you're borderline between any of those sizes, you've got options. You can either downsize so you can run a longer negative rise stem like the Pros, or you can upsize to get the longer reach for more stability. Despite the funky rear suspension design, the Super Caliber is actually quite an easy bike to set up. Trek recommends 25% sag for the rear shock, and for my 68 kilo riding weight, that worked out to be around 135 psi, and I set the rebound damping halfway at 7 out of 14 clicks. I've tested the SID SL before, and I set up this fork exactly the same with 100 psi inside the air spring. I also added a single bottomless token for a little bit more end stroke support, and I set the rebound damping a little bit slower than halfway, 7 out of 19 clicks. The stock tyres are quite lightweight. These are Bontrager XR2 Team Issue tyres, and they weigh a confirmed 650 grams each. Because they're quite light and flexible, I end up running a little bit more air pressure than usual with 23 psi in the front, 26 psi in the rear. Given the rocky, aggressive nature of my local trails, I also added a tyre invader insert into the rear wheel for a little extra pinch flat and rim protection. Now, without doubt, the biggest standout attribute of the Super Caliber is just how efficient it is to ride. This bike is so fast, which isn't exactly surprising given it weighs just 9.5 kilos. But what did impress me every time I rode the Super Caliber is just how responsive it is under power, with a really strong surge upon every pedal stroke. There's excellent efficiency via the IsoStrut suspension design, and the main pivot on this bike sits quite high and far forward, and that gives it a load of anti-squat, really snappy organic pedaling performance, which is unrivaled by any other full suspension bike I've tested. Certainly for off-road use, there's no need to use the lockout at all. The only reason you'd flick that is to stabilize the fork for out of the saddle sprinting, and that's exactly why it's there. Otherwise, you can leave this bike totally unlocked when you're riding off-road. To match the efficient pedaling performance, the handling on the Super Caliber is just as responsive. Thanks to the short 70mm stem and that 69-degree head angle, the front end steering on this bike is very sharp and it's very reactive too. The compact rear end helps too. It allows you to initiate turns really easily and also change direction rapidly. There's certainly nothing flaccid about the carbon chassis either. Aside from those slim seat stays, everything's quite oversized and stout. And the IsoStrut design is also much stiffer laterally compared to a conventional swing link. All of this minimizes wiggle through the frame, and that helps to translate your handling inputs into the tire contact patches with less hesitation, whilst also delivering more haptic feedback from the trail too. The low-hanging bottom bracket also keeps you lower to the ground for good stability, and combined with the sharp steering and the effervescent suspension performance, the Super Caliber is a real hover bike. There's certainly no denying that it isn't as cushy as a conventional 100mm travel bike, but the Super Caliber is more sympathetic than a hardtail, and it is surprisingly comfortable on the trail. There's decent small bump sensitivity, and that allows the rear wheel to track smoothly across micro terrain, and it gives this bike usable traction on the climbs. And that's good news because with the low weight, taut frame and the efficient pedaling performance, the Super Caliber is an exceptionally handy climber. The 74-degree seat tube angle does sound a little slack these days, but with the saddle in my preferred position, it actually measures up at 75 degrees and it feels spot on for me. There's also less sag from the rear suspension on the climbs, and that helps to maintain that seat tube angle for longer. Certainly for typical XC racing conditions, the Super Calibre provides a nice balance between smoothing off those harsh edges and providing usable traction on the climbs, while also having really stable pedalling performance. Even when you jump out of the saddle midway up a technical climb, the back end responds quickly and there's just no wallowing from the rear shock whatsoever. And that being said, the Super Calibre doesn't feel like it has any more than 60mm of rear wheel travel. While the initial travel is quite smooth and effective, it soon ramps up. If you hit a rocky section at pace, it is bouncier and harsher compared to a conventional 100mm travel bike. Certainly compared to the likes of the Cannondale Scalpel and the Pivot Mach 4 SL, there is less square edge compliance here. If you ease off the gas, the rear wheel is more likely to catch those edges. For those rockier sections, I found the best method with the Super Calibre was to really attack the trail, look for the smoother lines and try and skip over the chunder where possible, which is actually quite easy on this bike given it's so light and so responsive. When things start getting really fast and really wild, it is possible to bottom out the rear shock on harder impacts. The first time it happened to me, I thought something had broken because it's quite a harsh metallic clunk when you hit full travel. It sounds a lot worse than it is, and it thankfully wasn't a common occurrence when I was riding on typical cross-country terrain. However, if you are bottoming out the rear shock on this bike regularly, you can increase progression by adding larger volume spaces. The process is trickier compared to a conventional rear shock, and unfortunately Trek doesn't include those volume spaces with the Super Calibre, which seems ridiculous on a bike costing over 15 grand. It certainly works. I did try the medium orange volume spacer in the rear shock on our test bike, and while it did firm up the rear suspension a little more, it basically eliminated bottom out completely, so it's nice to have that adjustment available. I also made some other modifications to the Super Calibre throughout testing. I added a Bike Yoke Divine SL dropper post, some 2.4-inch Maxxis wide trail tyres, a 760mm Renthal fat bar, and, since the frame is rated for it, a 120mm RockShox SID. If you're keen to find out what impact those changes had on the Super Calibre's ride quality, make sure you click that link in the video description, and that will take you through to the full review over at flowmountainbike.com, where I go into much more detail about those modifications. As for the stock build, well, thankfully there are very few chinks in the armour. The SRAM Axis drivetrain is superb, and the Level Ultimate brakes also impress with their smooth carbon lever blades, light action and usable power. I would like to see a PM160 mount for the rear disc brake caliper so you could remove the adapter entirely. I'm not really sure who's still using 140mm rotors these days. I would like to see torque caps on the front hub to match the oversized dropouts on the SID SL fork. It's currently quite faffy to locate the axle when you're fitting the front wheel, and it's a shame to see Trek skip over what is a small but nice detail. Otherwise, the Covey XXX wheels are outstanding. These are exceptionally lightweight. They came in at 1,325 grams on our scales, which is impressive given they have a 29mm internal rim width, which provides really good support for lightweight race tyres. On the trail, they are nice and whippy, and there's excellent pickup from that 54-tooth free hub mechanism, but there are only 24 spokes front and rear. I did manage to put a stick through the rear wheel on one ride. That broke a spoke and put a decent wobble into the rear wheel. I replaced that spoke and it's been fine ever since, but that same stick did manage to rip a tooth off the lower jockey wheel on the derailleur and bend the master link on the chain. Surprisingly, both the derailleur and the hanger are still dead straight, which is really impressive. Otherwise, I've had no issues with our test bike, though out of curiosity, I did pull the IsoStrut assembly apart to give it a service, which Trek recommends every 125 hours of ride time, which is the same as a lower leg fork service. The process itself is pretty straightforward, and all you'll need is 10-weight suspension oil to lubricate the inside of the carriage, but you will need to remove the whole swing arm from the frame to get in there in the first place, so it does make servicing a more involved process compared to a conventional full suspension bike. Now, over the past 12 months, I've had the chance to ride a number of different full suspension race bikes, and you might be wondering how the Super Calibre compares to some of those bikes. I'll start off with the Cannondale Scalpel, which is currently one of the most progressive XC race bikes on the market, certainly in terms of its suspension performance. On rough terrain, the Scalpel is plusher and more active than the Super Calibre, and that gives it more comfort and more traction overall. The steering is still quite sharp thanks to the precise lefty fork and the 55mm offset, but thanks to that active suspension performance, it is the better descending bike for sure. It's not as efficient as the Super Calibre though, and it is much more reliant on the remote lockout. Additionally, some riders might be put off by the proprietary fork, hub and the AI drivetrain offset. On the trail, I'd say the Specialized Epic is the closest competitor to the Super Caliber. Both bikes have a similar ethos. They employ a proprietary suspension design that prioritizes pedaling efficiency, but the way they go about it is quite different. The Epic obviously uses the Brain damper to stabilize both the fork and the rear shock, and it creates an automatic platform that you don't have to think about while you're riding, and it also results in a really nice clean cockpit. While the Brain is adjustable, it doesn't quite provide a full lockout, and that differs from the Super Caliber, which can be turned into pretty much a fully rigid bike at the flick of a lever. The Brain also exhibits a knocking sensation every time the valve opens up, and you'll typically feel a lot of the smaller impacts and vibrations on the trail, which can make it quite an unrelenting bike to ride. Even with less travel, the Super Caliber is more comfortable to ride than the Epic, and that's particularly the case up front, where the regular SID SL is considerably plusher and more active than the Brain-equipped SID on the Epic. That said, when the Brain is open on the descents, the Epic is the more stable bike of the two thanks to its slacker head angle and longer reach. The frame is also a touch lighter on the Epic, but you do pay for it. It's a considerably more expensive bike than the Super Caliber. The Orbea Oiz was also recently updated with a new OMX carbon frame and a sleek one-piece swing arm. Despite having the full 100mm of rear wheel travel, the Oiz OMX frame is claimed to be almost 200 grams lighter than the Super Caliber. Now it'll still take 2 water bottles, and you can fit up to a 120mm fork on the front, and you can upstroke the shock to get 120mm on the back as well, giving it a load of versatility. What makes it particularly versatile on the trail though is the Squid Lock remote, which gives you on-the-fly adjustable suspension. You do need to toggle the remote regularly on the trail to get the most out of it, and that differs from the Super Caliber, where you can leave it open the majority of the time. Even with the suspension open though, the Super Caliber is still more efficient, and the handling is more responsive, particularly through the corners. The Oiz is the better descending bike of the two though, with its wider bars, 2.35-inch tyres, and its plusher suspension performance, giving it more control and more confidence. On top of that, the Oiz does sell for quite a bit less than the Super Caliber, and while I would like to see a steering limiter, it is otherwise a really well-rounded package for the money. And that, my friends, brings us to the verdict of the 2021 Trek Super Caliber. In pursuing the unique IsoStrut suspension design, Trek has been able to create what is one of the fastest and most efficient XC bikes currently on the market. It's not as light as a hardtail, and it's also not as plush as a conventional 100mm travel bike. But with its clean lines, stompable efficiency and cornering precision, the Super Caliber presents the most convincing argument yet to the hardtail versus full suspension debate. If you'd like to read more about the Super Caliber, there's a load more information about our experience of testing this bike in the full review over at flowmountainbike.com. There's a link in the video description below. Click that and that will take you through to the review on this bike here. If you've got any questions for me about the Super Caliber and how it compares to some of the other XC bikes we've tested, make sure you put your questions into the comments below, and don't forget to give us a thumbs up if you enjoyed this video. Otherwise, that's it from me, guys. I'll see you next time. Tooroo!